So we're going to talk about science, humanities, integration. We have to get clear about what we're talking about. What do we mean by sciences? What do we mean by the humanities? I think the most efficient way to get a sense of what the humanities are about is to talk about a book that was required reading when I was in graduate school, Clifford Geertz's Interpretation of Cultures. Now, what I particularly would like to focus on in Geertz's work is one passage. So he's drawing on this distinction developed by the philosopher Gilbert Ryle between thin and thick description. And he tells a story. He says, he's quoting Ryle here. Ryle says, imagine two children. So one of them is winking to a conspirator. So he's playing some sort of trick. He winks at the guy who's in on the trick. Imagine another boy who is doing the exact same physical motion. So his eye goes like that. But in his case, he's just blinking because something got in his eye. It's not an intentional act. He's not trying to communicate something. Ryle's point is that on a camera, so if you were filming this, it might look exactly the same. The physical movement might be exactly the same, but the meaning is completely different. One of them is an intentional act. It's a communicative act. It has meaning. The other one's just a physical movement. So thin description, on Ryle's term, is what you get from a camera. It's the external scene, it's the physical scene, it's what's going on physically. Thick description is the human meaning of the scene. And it may be very different. So the same exact physical configuration of events may have very different thick meanings, may have very different human meanings for people. So this basic dichotomy that Ryle sets up and Geertz is adopting between thin and thick description maps on to two different modes of understanding. So one is understanding in a technical sense, in German verstehen. So this is what's going on in thick description and understanding the thick descriptions of others. It requires a human mind. In order to understand what's going on in a wink, you have to understand the whole backstory of who the people are, what they're intending, what their relationships are. You need this human understanding of the scene. There's then explanation, so in German erklären, which is the reductionistic explanation of how the muscles in the eyelid work and what's going on when a mote of dust goes into someone's eye. So these are different ways of engaging with the world. Understanding requires this kind of sensitivity. You need to be a human to do it. You need to be interacting with other human products. And traditionally, this has been the view of the humanities. What we do in the humanities is engage in thick description and engage in this kind of verstehen understanding, sympathetic understanding of the products of other human beings. This is particularly what we do in the humanities, whereas the sciences do explanation. They do mechanistic explanation of cause and effect. So if you want to think about it another way, thick description, verstehen, understanding involves intentions, human intentions that need to be interpreted in various ways, whereas what the sciences study are billiard ball causation. So random physical things banging into other physical things, Newtonian physics, that's what the sciences study. So this has really been, I think most humanities scholars, this would make sense to them in terms of their self-understanding of what the humanities do as opposed to the sciences. I've spent a large part of my career arguing in favor of science-humanities integration, and one of the things I've been arguing is I think less widely recognized but important to see, which is that this distinction between modes of understanding, so understanding versus erklären, explanation, thick description versus thin description, are really dependent on and grow out of mind-body dualism. And this is something that people don't always recognize, but it's important to see. It's interesting because it's very clear in German. And this is not irrelevant because the structure of the German universities in the 19th century had a lot to do with the way the disciplines are now cut up even today in North America and the West. So in German, the humanities are called the Geisteswissenschaften. So the knowledges or the sciences of the Geist. Now, what is Geist? Geist can be translated as mind, it can be translated as soul, but it's cognate with the English ghost. So ghost, it's really the ghost in the machine. So Geist is the thing that makes us human. It's our soul, it's our spirit, it's our mind. And so the Geisteswissenschaften study the products of the Geist. And understood that way, what's involved in understanding in this act of verstehen, when one human understands another human, is a kind of it's kind of magic. it's this, I always have thought of it in terms of like the Vulcan mind meld. It's this special thing that one Geist can do. There's this fusing of Geists and they can understand one another. It's a special power that only humans have, and really because we have minds, whereas the Naturwissenschaften, so the natural sciences, study the dumb movement of inert objects. And so it's important to see that a really sharp divide between types of engaging with the world, whether you're doing it through understanding or whether you're doing it through explanation, only I think is defensible in terms of really seeing them as separate things if you are committed to a kind of mind-body dualism, if you think there's something really different ontologically in terms of the structure of the universe about human beings as opposed to all other physical things in the world. Now, this course is based on a naturalistic picture of the world. In the naturalistic picture of the world, there's not a sharp divide between humans and other things in the world. The human mind is an emergent phenomenon. There's a lot of debate about what that means, that it's emergent. But what's pretty clear is that the human mind is embodied. So I think the current cutting edge in cognitive science is that we are not disembodied Geists somehow inhabiting physical bodies. Our thought, our feelings, our ability to understand things grows out of our embodiment. So human thought grows out of our physical bodies, the way we're situated in the world and the way in which we interact with physical environments. So if strong mind-body dualism is not defensible, I think strong humanities science division is also not defensible. There's no reason to think that the study of physical things, the study of the physical world, can't tell us something about human beings. So in my mind, this is really the primary argument in favor of science-humanities integration, is that human beings are part of the natural world and we should understand them using the same tools we use to understand the natural world, or at least potentially what we know about the natural world can help inform the way we understand human beings. This basically is the argument behind calls for what's been called consilience, so consilience between science and humanities, or Tooby and Kosmitis have called this vertical integration, so trying to integrate what we do at the humanistic level with what we know about lower levels of explanation. So human realities, human levels of explanation grow out of physical things. They grow out of chemistry and physics and chemistry and biology, and we should understand human beings as part of a kind of chain of explanation that descends into the physical world. And I think this makes a lot of sense. So the early pioneers in this regard were people like E.O. Wilson, who coined the term consilience, Steven Pinker, who argued against blank slate views of the human mind. Now, there's been some kickback against these arguments for consilience from humanities scholars, and there's been some bad reasons for this. I think there's a certain amount of just conservatism in all fields, but there are some good reasons. And one of the, I think, important counter-arguments against some of the early calls for consilience was that they didn't take culture seriously enough. So they treated human beings as if we were still Pleistocene animals that just happen to have culture and language, but that those aren't affecting us in any kind of basic way. So in my mind, the most infamous expression of this is E.O. Wilson at one point talks about the human mind as a photographic negative waiting to hit the developer fluid. And what's problematic about this picture is the idea that all the structure is already there in our genes, and the only thing the environment is doing is evoking that structure. So this is sometimes called the evoked view of culture. So we've got it all, the structure's all in us, and all that the environment is doing is eliciting some kind of reaction from that structure that's already there. What we're going to be arguing in this course is that the picture is much more complicated. So the culture actually has its own independent stream of evolutionary processes going on, and culture feeds back on genes. So culture can change genes, and more importantly, on a faster, shorter time frame, culture has a huge effect on human cognition. Culture affects human cognition in a variety of ways. So my colleagues and I have sometimes talked about this as second wave consilience. In other words, consilience, but updated a bit in the sense that we're taking culture more seriously and as an independent causal factor in human cognition, not just as something that comes out of human nature, and also trying to talk about science-humanities integration in a way that makes more sense to humanities scholars. It shows how actually we can answer questions that humanities scholars care about and ideally resolve controversies in the humanities. So to give a concrete sense of how science-humanities integration can help with the study of religious history, with religious concepts and historical context, we can take the example in China of so-called mind-body holism. So there's a position in my field that the early Chinese were mind-body holists. So they were completely different. Westerners are mind-body dualists. We think in terms of minds and bodies. The Chinese were different. They thought of the self as this kind of completely integrated, holistic oneness. The idea of mind-body dualism or reason-emotion dualism was completely absent in this culture. And it's really it's caused in the West by Plato or Descartes or Christianity. There's a variety of stories about how it happened in the West. But what's important about these stories, the way they're told, and typically in my field, is they're all about culture. There's no reference at all to any kind of evolved similarities in human beings. So the fact that human beings are Homo sapiens, we're evolved animals, people in early China are Homo sapiens, people right now in Vancouver are Homo sapiens, you're going to expect there to be some commonalities based on our evolved nature. This never enters into the conversation. And this is where I think taking both understanding from the sciences and taking methods from the sciences can be helpful. So one of the things I've been arguing in some of my earlier work is that even though mind-body dualism is probably not supportable scientifically, it's part of our folk psychology. And we'll be talking about this a lot in modules 2 and 3. The norm now when we approach a text is assuming that it's got to be different. So you look at a text that's written in early China, it's written in classical Chinese, a very different language from Indo-European languages, they must think really differently. And I think this is one of the mistakes in our field. We've taken the idea that culture is important too far and thinking that culture and language are determining everything. So as opposed to this strong linguistic cultural constructivist position that would argue that any text written in a different language at a different time has got to be radically different, if you're approaching text from an embodied science humanities integrated position, you're going to start from a position of assumed commonality. We've got these especially very basic cognitive structures are going to be shared by human beings throughout time and across cultures. I also talked in lecture 4 about the demise of big theories in religious studies. So the early pioneers in religious studies had these big theories about how religion changed over time, about the evolution of religion over time. And these were very culturally parochial in certain ways. They had very severe limitations. And there was this kickback in religious studies against explanation. So against explanation and more towards understanding. What I was taught in graduate school, the reason they assigned Clifford Geertz to us was that what we do as religious studies scholars is verstehen. We do thick description. Now, while thick description is incredibly important, we can't do our work as scholars of religion without detailed understanding of ancient texts or of particular communities of believers and practitioners. I think in some ways this has ended up paralyzing religious studies. And so what we've ended up with, because we're so allergic to explanation, is what you could think of as endless butterfly collecting. We collect these thick ethnographies of religious practitioners or groups. We do detailed studies of particular texts. We have a lot of data. We have a lot of thick knowledge about religion and not a whole lot of stories about how that diversity gets generated or what the commonalities are underneath that diversity. So I think the powerful thing about the cognitive science of religion is it can provide us with explanatory theories that help us make sense of our data. We can get explanation back in the game, and we can start to tell, for instance, functionalist stories about religions. So what do we mean by functionalist? What's a functionalist theory? It's a theory that argues that religious behavior, beliefs, religious phenomena are serving some sort of either individual or social function. Now, functionalism, especially when it's applied to religion, bothers people. People get uncomfortable about it. And the common charge that's laid is that of reductionism. So by reducing religious phenomenon to deeper reasons, you're missing the point of them. You're missing what faith is about. You're missing what ritual is about. You're cheapening religious phenomenon by postulating some kind of functional role for them. So the worry among critics of cognitive science of religion and science humanities integration more generally is by connecting human level truths, so things like beauty or honor or integrity, to lower level functional forces like social solidarity. you're cheapening these things. You're missing the point of them, and you're actually not explaining these phenomena anymore because there's some kind of fundamental gap between what's going on at the human level and things that are going on below. So I want to address this issue of reductionism because it's an important one. So one thing to keep in mind is that any sort of reasonable story about vertical integration or consilience recognizes the relative independence of levels of explanation. Let's say we're talking about what makes a poem beautiful. There are things at the level of human poetry in a specific language that are emergent properties. They have to do with the nature of the language, they have to do with cultural traditions about what makes a good poem and what makes a bad poem. You can't predict those from physics. You can't predict those from neuroscience. These are things that are going on at a cultural level, and they've got a kind of independent reality to them. And it's important to see this is not something special about human level things. This is true throughout the chain of explanation. So if you're moving, for instance, from physical chemistry to organic chemistry, once you get organic molecules, you have new things going on, new principles, you have new entities that are necessary for explanatory purposes. This is why I think sometimes people who are opposed to science-humanities integration don't quite get this. The sciences are not one big monolithic discipline. It's not just physics. You don't just go over to the science part of campus and there's only a physics department. You have physical chemistry, you have people doing organic chemistry, you have people doing psychology, you have people doing neuroscience. Even in the field of psychology itself, there's all different layers. People studying neurons, individual neurons, everything up to social psychology that's studying psychology of human beings and groups and how they interact on large scales. Reductionism done right is not eliminative reductionism. So that's where you're saying these phenomena, organic molecules don't exist, we should just talk about physics, quantum physics. And I don't think anyone takes that seriously in any field. So we're not talking about eliminative reductionism. The other thing to keep in mind is that when it comes to human level truths, we're human beings. And so there's a sense in which human level truths have a power for us and an inescapable nature for us that's really specific to the fact that we're human. So to give you an example, one that I like to use is parental love. So as parents, we do all kinds of crazy things for our children. We make sacrifices for them, we care for them under difficult conditions, we buy them all sorts of ridiculous things to make them happy. Why do we do this? Again, this is like religious behavior. It's one of those things that seems natural, but you'd want an explanation for it. So the only explanation from an evolutionary naturalistic perspective that makes any sense is what's called Hamilton's rule. And this is reductionism at its best. So why do we care for our children? Because they're carrying copies of our genes. So from a genes level perspective, we care for our offspring because they're copies of us that are going off into the future. So Hamilton's rule is a great example of a very powerful scientific theory that explains a huge variety of phenomena in a very satisfying way. Everything from human parental care through mammalian parental care and parental care in various species all make sense in terms of this mathematical equation. It's an equation about what percentage of relatedness there is in the individual you're going to be caring for or cooperating with. Now, why I like this example is because it's so horrible. The idea that you care for your offspring because of genes that they are carrying just strikes us as a classic example of evil reductionism or eliminative reductionism. So this is where we need to get clear about the difference between ultimate explanations and proximate mechanisms. So Hamilton's rule, inclusive fitness, the genes level view, is an ultimate explanation. It's about what the evolutionary causal forces are that created this behavior. But the way in which that ultimate causation causes the behavior to happen is going to be different in different species. In human beings, it does it by implanting in us this completely irrational and very powerful and unavoidable feeling of love. So at the proximate level, the reason we care for our children is because we love them. We're not actually doing the calculation and thinking, oh, you're carrying half my genes, I guess I'll get you a new toy. This is ridiculous. So you don't want to confuse, when people worry about reductionism, sometimes it's because they're confusing ultimate explanation with proximate mechanisms. No one's questioning the fact that at a proximate level, any psychologically healthy human being is caring for their children because they love them and because they're so cute. And what's interesting is this distinction between ultimate ultimate and proximate often creates problems for the ultimate mechanism. So it actually causes behavior that wasn't intended, that actually is a byproduct, because it's the proximate mechanisms can take on their own force. So that's what arguably leads to pets. That's why we have pets. And pets have been, for instance, dogs have co-evolved with human beings for probably several thousand years to become cute. And what does it mean to be cute? They look more like human children. It's why adoptive parents love their children just as much as biological parents, because the same cues are working on them. So they got to not mix up ultimate and proximate. We don't ignore the fact that at a proximate level, human beings love their children because they love their children. They just have a deep irrational love for their children. We don't ignore the fact that people participating in a religious ritual are doing it because they care about God and they love their fellow parishioners and they're feeling a sense of collective effervescence. There may be a deeper ultimate functional explanation for why this practice was created or why it survives, but that's not in the heads of the individuals who are doing it. So in fact, a person who was actually thinking about genetic relatedness or Hamilton's rule when they were caring for their child or deciding to cooperate with someone in an adventure, there probably are people like that. They're psychopaths, right? So normal human beings, psychologically normal human beings, are moved by emotions, by these evolved emotions, and those have a force and a reality at the human level that can't be denied and can't be escaped. A psychologically normal human being can't escape human level truth in an important sense. There's some limits to the scientific project in the explanation of religion, and those limits have to do with this difference between ultimate and proximate. So at the proximate level, we seem to be primed for certain types of religious-like cognition, and no matter how much we understand about the causes, perhaps ultimate causes of that cognition, that's never going to change the fact that we still feel these things very deeply, that we still live them at the human level. Hey Frosty, you want to go for a walk? You want to go for a walk? Let's go for a walk.